Hello everyone, I'm Ann Baldwin and welcome to this edition of Law Matters, brought to you by the law firm of HASSETT and George right here in Simsbury. With more and more people deciding to start their own businesses these days because either they're being downsized or they just want to follow their entrepreneurial spirit, starting a business is a huge decision and also quite a process. Here today on Law Matters to help us better understand the opportunity and the risks are attorney Martin CLAYMAN, an attorney with the law firm of HASSETT and George, and also attorney Judy GEDGE. She's assistant professor of business law at QUINNIPIAC University School of Business. Marty and Judy, thank you for sharing with our viewers of this program what it's like, what people need to know, and maybe to take some of the fear and, the procrastination out of the process. So what are some of the first steps from your perspective? When you meet with folks, Marty, you say step 1, 2, and 3 is ...
Well, of course, there are many, many legal considerations in starting a business, and you have to start somewhere. So a lot of people, they really, once they've kind of got the hankering that they want to start a business, they want to think about the name of the business. And if a person decides to start a business under his or her own name, then there really isn't too much you have to do because it's a sole proprietorship and the name is there. But many people like to come up with something catchy for marketing purposes or otherwise, and they'll come up with a fictitious or an assumed name. And so I instruct these people that one of the first things they have to do if they decide to operate under an assumed or fictitious name, they have to file a certificate of trade name with the town clerk in the town in which the business is operating. And it's a very inexpensive process and it's a very simple process, and the purpose of it is to protect the consuming public. If someone enters a business and is injured some way, they want to be able to know who they have to sue, who they have to notify about that injury. And if you have a made-up name like Quality Bakery, for example, how are you going to know?
So it's doing business as. So you might call it this and then DBA, right?
Yes,
that's
how it's usually done. We call them DBAs, doing business as. And it's a simple enough process to do. Even corporations and limited liability companies, of which there are many, many in this state, if those entities, it's a legal entity now, if those entities want to operate under an assumed name, even those entities have to file a trade name certificate. So that's a first easy baby step, excuse me, that people can make when they want to get their business going.
Right, and to that point, Judy, you start a business, and one of the things I never thought about is I'm doing public relations. Why would anybody ever want to sue me? Why would I ever get in trouble with that? But you need to understand that there are liabilities for you personally sometimes, depending on the structure of your business, of your corporation, et cetera, right?
Yes, I think one of the challenges and one of the things that I've heard so much over the years is that when somebody decides to start a business, all of a sudden everybody in their life is an expert giving them advice. And it seems that the structure of the business is something that everybody seems to have the answer to. And oftentimes when I was in private practice, people who were starting a business would come in and they would lay out the most complicated business structure and said, this is what I think I need to do. And when I would ask them a little bit more, and eventually it would turn out that they'd been doing research on the internet and that this was the conclusion they came to. And I think the important thing for anyone starting a business is to sit down and identify what are the risks of that business. And I will tell you, it's not the most fun part of starting a business.
Right.
But the purpose of doing that is so that each business owner, each entrepreneur can create their own game plan to minimize the risk in their business and maximize the potential for success. And once you've got that information at hand, then it becomes a more straightforward issue of how are we going to minimize those risks. I will tell you, you mentioned sort of three rules. I will tell you that I actually do have 3 pretty hard and fast rules for people who are starting a small business, and they are to, number 1, to form and properly maintain a limited liability entity. And I know we'll probably have a chance to talk about corporations and LLCs in a minute. 2 is to always maintain appropriate liability insurance. And 3, always use written contracts. So I know we could probably do a whole
I'll bless
segment
that
on
one
each one of
especially.
those. But I think it's important for people to see that they really have to approach this in a systematic manner and really put together a game plan for their business, not only on the business plan side, yes, that's important, but also minimizing legal risks.
And I really like that point 3 as somebody who's had my own business now for 20 years. The contract piece. I was told that a long, long time ago. And you know, unlike Quinnipiac, where I went to school at Colorado State University, they didn't teach these things in a classroom. They taught you other things. They didn't teach you about being an entrepreneur or a business owner. So I kind of had to learn on my own. But that's one piece of advice that people have given me, to have that standard contract that you just switch up for each client. And I can tell you, in 20 years of doing business, I've only had to chase one person for my money. That's pretty good. 20 years, one person. It wasn't a pretty process, but I got my money. So that is especially important too, is having those other structures so that once you start your business, you've got those legal pieces in place. Do you need confidentiality agreements? Do you need photo releases? I mean, depending on the kind of businesses, I think that's really good information. And again, I applaud, you know, universities like Quinnipiac for putting these real life skills, because you know, I was listening to a radio program last night. This is the future. This is where the economy's going to get its boost. It's people starting their own businesses. And back when you said, like, if I told my parents out of college I was going to start my own business, they would have told me probably that I'm crazy. You know, you just didn't do that. But more and more people are doing this and becoming very, very successful at it. So I think it's fantastic and great advice. Let's talk a little bit about the legal structure that we touched upon earlier. You know, Martin, you talked about before, you know, when you have a corporation, people understand that. People say corporation, you know, it's got this, you know, connotation to it. But what are the other options? You know, limited liability, what's more affordable, what's more realistic, or does it depend on the business and the services that you offer?
Well, again, things always depend upon the business and the services, but for the average individual starting a business, it could be a contractor, it could be a grocery store, it could be a bakery, it could be a cleaner, it could be somebody in the financial services, for example, travel services. It really doesn't make a lot of difference. We usually recommend that they consider a limited liability company, and the reason is it has all of the features of a corporation in terms of limited liability, and it has many of the features of a sole proprietorship, in that there are few formalities that people have to follow in order to maintain a limited liability company. Most people don't want to go through the formality of having an annual meeting of shareholders and directors. Why bother doing that in a small mom and pop corporation, or company, I should say, where let's say the husband is, you know, the president, the wife is the secretary. It could be the other way around, of course, you know. And there's just the two of them, and to go through a board of directors meeting and a shareholders meeting and an officers meeting and so on. You can eliminate all that with a limited liability company. So that came down the pike and has been really adopted by all 50 states in the United States. Took a little while for some of the states to go along, but Connecticut was one of the early adopters of that body of statutes. So it really has been a boon, made it a lot easier for people. It's almost deceptively easy, which is one of the problems, because a lot of people think you can just go online and file a one-page piece of paper, which is called Articles of Organization, and then you're all set to go. But it isn't really true, because you need what is known as an operating agreement as well. And that's normally prepared by an attorney.
Right.
There are very few people that know how to do that. But many people, they think, well, I'm just going to go get this little form and file it, pay my fee, and I'm out of the woods here, get started. It isn't really that easy.
And what are the consequences if you don't do that? I know, you know, it's what could happen.
Well, if you think you formed an LLC, or you think you formed a corporation, just because you've made the filing with the Secretary of State, you may find down the road that you don't actually have the legal protection that you were hoping to achieve. And that can arise through a legal doctrine called piercing the veil. And I know, Marty, you were talking about with corporations the importance of having those meetings of shareholders and directors and officers. And, you know, for a small, closely held corporation, especially, for instance, a single shareholder corporation. Sometimes clients think you're absolutely crazy when you nag them and say it's time, once a year, it's time for that annual meeting of shareholders again. It's time for that annual meeting of directors. And the reason why it's so important is that under this legal doctrine of piercing the veil, if you don't take the appropriate steps to properly document and maintain your business entity, then if someone ends up suing your business, they have the potential to what's called pierce through that veil and get to your personal assets. And if we go back to a basic principle, which is that in choosing a business entity, one of the main factors is to structure your business in a way that best protects your personal assets. So yeah, important to have the proper documentation, and yeah, not enough to just file that one-page form that you can download from the Secretary of State's office.
Right, and like you said, Marty, people think it's just, easy and accessible. And the other thing is, too, that I find in some businesses, if you're going to be applying for, let's say, state or federal contracts, you need a lot of the stuff for qualification for those contracts, or you're not going to be allowed into the bidding process, too.
Well, if you're going to borrow money from a bank, for example, they're going to want to see your operating agreement more often than not. If you're going to be involved in some federal contract, they're going to want to know that you have an operating agreement. They
And
want
insurance.
To know, and insurance, of course. But they want to know that you've complied with all the formalities of what it takes to become a true limited liability company. Those are very important things. I do want to break in about one little thing that sometimes gets overlooked. People form these entities, corporations, limited liability companies, and then they sign a contract. And what do? They sign John Jones. They don't put down president, they don't put down member, they just put down John Jones. So they've just ruined everything that they've done because they've created personal liability. So what we do is we instruct our clients how to sign a contract to avoid personal liability. And people every day get into trouble because they do just what I said. They sign their name.
I didn't know that. 20 years into this thing. Thank you for that advice. Ann Baldwin, president, from here on out, that's what it is.
That's what you've got to do.
Wow. And Judy,
Yeah.
you wanted to say something
Yeah,
about
I did.
this?
Another thing, we were talking about operating agreements or sometimes about shareholder agreements. Yes, they're very important in terms of proper documentation for, in terms of piercing the veil. But another thing is that if you've got a business that has 2 or more owners, then you really need, as owners, to work out the terms of your business relationship together. And that's handled in an LLC, it's handled in the operating agreement. For a corporation, it's handled in a shareholders agreement. And oftentimes I've had clients come in and they're best friends. And we start talking about the importance of putting this all down on paper, and it's not unusual for them to say, but I trust this person. I trust them with my life. So I'm not worried about anything on paper. And I think that's great, but it misses the point, which is that to a large extent, the reason that people end up in disputes and litigation is not because, I don't think anyway, that people are being dishonest.
Right.
I think it's because there's perhaps an underlying misunderstanding about what was intended. And so part of the startup, we haven't really focused on this too much today, but part of the issues in a startup is if you have 2 or more owners, to make sure that the owners have thought through these issues about who's going to put money in, how much, how's the money coming out, all kinds of issues like that.
Absolutely. And having had experience with that, you've got to tell people this isn't about friendship. This is about business. And I'm speaking from, sometimes I would be emotional about it and not smart. As a woman, I felt, it was more emotional than the brains. But over the course of time and with, mistakes made by people, you're right. You learn from that. And that partnership piece is so huge because it can be such a great asset to a business and growing a business, but it can also be a great distraction and counterproductive and actually lead to a lot of business failures. So I really appreciate that point, Judy, that you have to have those pieces in place to put it in writing, put it in a contract, and at least have that to fall back on. Like anything else we do in life, we have contracts. We don't just wing it, right? We don't just it's no longer just a handshake, correct? You've got to protect yourself, protect your interests, and protect, your financial interest especially. Let's talk a little bit about licensing. Does it depend on the kind of business as to what licensing that you might need to take out? I know for a lot of people, if you're going to serve alcohol, there's the liquor license. There's the liability insurance for that. If it's food related, how do you find out about that, and how do you protect yourself with that piece?
I think I can address that for you. The state of Connecticut has a plethora of licenses and permits that have to be obtained in order to legally conduct business. And there is a huge list of them. I think you can go online and get that information through the Department of Consumer Protection. You could call them. For people who use telephone directories, there's an entire list of departments relating to licenses and permits. Now, interestingly, my wife, before she retired, was an interior decorator. And she did not need a license, and she did not have a license. So she went out and she did her thing. But there is a license required for interior designers. Now, there is obviously some difference, and the state recognizes that difference. And there are licenses for, obviously we know that plumbers have to be licensed. We know that electricians have to be licensed. But there are surveyors, they have to be licensed. Barber shops have to be licensed. Then there are permits also. A license usually involves taking an examination and showing some proficiency. And permits usually are, well, you've got to basically pay the fee and get the permission in order to be able to, you don't usually have to take a test or anything like that. Now, a liquor is a permit usually. So you fill out the forms, you comply with the Liquor Commission's requirements, and you pay the fee. And so you get your permit. And there are a number of other types of permits that you can obtain. But it's another consideration for someone starting business to do your homework, do your due diligence, and one of the things you've got to find out is, do I need a license or a permit to start this business?
Well, let's say that you're buying somebody's existing business, that I'm going to buy the bar down the street, and they already have the licensing, and they already have the permits. Doesn't that come with the price tag?
No.
Not in that example.
Interestingly enough, liquor permits in Connecticut are not transferable. You have to start all over again. Now, contrast that with Massachusetts, where you can sell a liquor license, make a lot of money. They are saleable. Connecticut, they're worthless. They're only good for the permittee who actually got the permit. Connecticut will not allow you to sell your license. And that may not be true with all licenses, but the same thing would be true, for example, with an automobile dealership or an automobile repair. You can't just sell your license.
What about a restaurant? A restaurant that's already been inspected by the health department or already been permitted for catering purposes, same kind of thing? You got to really kind of start from scratch?
You can buy the restaurant, but you have to take out your own license.
Okay.
The same thing is true with a lottery license. You can, there are people love lottery licenses, especially convenience stores. I've represented a lot of people who bought and sold convenience stores. You have to get the lottery license. You have to file the application and get it. You can't just transfer it.
The Department of Consumer Protection oversees many, many licenses. And I haven't been to it lately, but I know at one time they had a fabulous website which had a searchable database so that you could put keywords in there and it would tell you what licenses were associated with that. Hundreds, if not thousands, I don't know, but just a huge number of licenses. And so, and it's not the sort of thing you can rely on common sense. It's not like you can say, well, no, I can't believe that you really need a license to do such and such. You just need to double check it.
Is it a money grab? This is a question I want to ask. Is it a money grab or is it a necessity? I mean, some people might say, well, if they don't know, what they don't know won't hurt them. So how do you know when too much is too much and what's sufficient? I guess that's where the legal professional advice comes in. This is what you need, and if you go beyond that, you might need this level. I don't know. I'm asking.
Well, I mean, I can come up with examples. Like, for example, I represent a daycare provider, and they have to be licensed with the Department of Health. And they inspect these facilities, and they're very rigorous in monitoring the conduct of these businesses. So some of them are to protect the public for purposes of sanitation and quality and make sure that there are trained people on staff. And some of them are really, I have to say, revenue raising. Because there doesn't seem to be any apparent reason for it. Somebody, let's say, sells water. Well, you're supposed to have a license. I suppose, water can be tainted. It can be adulterated. So there is some basis for it, but it's kind of hard to conceive of some of these being other than a revenue-raising measure. And I'm not picking on water. I'm just giving you an example of
Water's
it.
good.
Some of these are somewhat questionable.
Right. That was a good example. Very,
Yeah.
neutral, if you will. Now, Judy, you've written some books, and you've got some of your own advice for people. Where can people access that in your own words and from your perspective?
Well, actually, I have stopped practicing law because I now teach full time.
Right.
And so what I recommend is, if people are looking for good advice for their business, is to work closely with a business lawyer. And I think it's great to get information from books. I don't generally recommend, by the way, people do their research on the internet, because there's no telling what they come up with. But they really should be building a close relationship with a team of professionals, including a business lawyer and a business accountant, insurance agent, and a banker. So some things are good information to get from a book, but legal advice, I think, is better directly from
And
a
there's
professional.
nothing like that direct contact and that direct conversation. Now, Marty, you've been doing this a long time, and boy, you've really seen practices change, and I'm assuming the things that you have to take into consideration when assisting somebody with a small business, like domain names. Did you ever think you would be dealing with some of the social media and some of the other, internet and intranet issues that you deal with today?
No,
You've got to stay on top of that, right?
These started coming up maybe 10, 15 years ago, where people would have issues about domain names, and more often than not, it would happen that somebody obtained a domain name, which is not that difficult to do.
No.
I think most people are able to do that with no real problem. But they have a domain name, and then someone writes them a letter and says, "You have just infringed on my trademark. I have a trademark for exactly that name, and you better close out you close out that domain name, or else." And they come in, they say, well, what is going on here? I filed this domain name. Well, what people don't realize is that filing a domain name does not protect you against trademark infringements. So once again, it's a due diligence matter. It's a matter of going on the website of the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office, find out if somebody has a trademark of the very domain name that you're looking for, save yourself a lot of grief, and then you can apply for your domain name, and you're all set. Domain names are also saleable.
Yes.
I've had a client who sold one. It was the first time it happened. He says, "I got this domain name, I want to sell it." I mean, you're looking for $30,000. I said, "Are you kidding me?" So he didn't sell it for $30,000, but he sold it for $10,000.
Wow.
And I helped him to make the sale and get the transfer. And it was very interesting. It was a first experience for me in that area.
Yeah. And you want to have that consistency with your domain name, with your website, with the name of your company, so that if one's taken or you can't go here with this, sometimes you have to reconsider renaming your entity and or your company. So one kind of stacks on top of the other, does it not?
Exactly right, exactly right. And I mean, there are people, by the way, who take out many domain names and they go all around the subject. They'll do abc.com, bca.com, abc.net, abc.biz, abc. They'll do everything to try to make sure that they're protected, and they've got the territory surrounded, so nobody can break in and get a domain name away from them. So I've seen that sort of conduct.
That's right. Well, and now let's talk about, we got about 5 minutes left in this program. Let's talk a little bit about financing. How do you know how much money to take out? Where do you get that money from? When you see startups and small businesses, what kind of advice do you have for folks as far as the financial piece? And I know that you're attorneys and not bankers, but you know something about this.
Right. Well, I think that it's important to have a clear idea of what your startup costs will be. And even though I don't get involved in the dollars and cents, I want to see the full picture. So when I was actively practicing law and people would come in and tell me they were planning to start a business, we'd talk about all kinds of things. And one of the questions I would say is, well, where's your startup budget? what are your sources of funds? What are your proposed uses of funds? Where will that come from? Because you want to make sure that people have thought through all of these what-if questions. And I know we've all heard stories and had experience with people who have great ideas, but they just didn't put enough of a financial package in place to begin with. And so important to have that cushion, so important to have that working capital reserve. And in terms of financing, lots of opportunities out there. I don't know how much the banks are lending these days. I know SBA-backed loans are still significant.
I think sometimes, though, the more organized you are and the more you've got your plan in place and you've done your due diligence, especially working with professionals, I would think a bank would be more open to than somebody who just walks in with an idea and says, can I borrow some money? I want to start a business. I mean, that adds to the credibility, I think, don't you?
Well, generally speaking, startups become an anathema to banks because they've gotten burned so many times in the past with people with great ideas, but they're, you know, long on hope and short on ability. So it's made it very challenging for people to start their own businesses if they need a fair amount of capital. So they have to start thinking about other sources of funds. Now, there was a time when people used to tap the equity in their homes before we had that wonderful Great Recession that we've all suffered through for many years. Many people don't have the equity in their homes anymore, or they would refinance their home if they were not underwater. So there was a source, a ready source of funds. The SBA, Small Business Administration, does help people, but you're more likely to get help if you're buying an existing business than if you're just doing a startup. They will provide equipment loans, they will provide operating capital, they'll provide real estate loans. There's a gamut. Of course, there was a shutdown, as you know, in the government, and everything came to a screeching halt. But generally speaking, it's a wonderful organization that does help people to purchase businesses. Not so much with startups, but purchasing.
So much to consider, so much to think about, but I can tell you from experience, so well worth it. So Judy Gedge, Assistant Professor of Business Law at Quinnipiac University, and Martin Clayman, attorney for the law firm of Hassett and George, right here in Simsbury. I want to thank you both again for your expertise and your great knowledge and sharing that with our viewers on this segment of Law Matters. Should you want any additional information regarding this program or any other legal matters, we invite you to visit the website at hgesq.com. That's hgesq.com. I'm Ann Baldwin. Thank you so much for watching this segment of Law Matters, and we'll see you again for our next edition of this program.
Funding for Simsbury Community Television is provided in part by contributions from viewers like you. Thank you.